Why did it take so long to come up with YouTube? Most people have never thought about this, but why did it take until 2005 to be able to come up with YouTube? But it's just a video, you might say. How did they not know of it at the time? How did it take them so long to come up with it? How could you miss something that is now so blatantly obvious to us? Well, to find out why it took until 2005 for YouTube to come about, we must first go back to ancient times. Roughly 3,750 years ago, a device constructed with a spindle in the middle of it had a rotating set of images when spun by the handler. When it was spun, it looked as though the images were moving, and thus the illusion of them coming after one another was seen. The more images you put in between, the smoother the transition between the images, and the less distinguishable they were to the naked eye from the motion of reality. This is known today as the frame rate that a motion picture runs at. These devices are still around today and are quite primitive in their conception. Inanimate cave dwellings preceded this invention, so this was the first example of a story being able to be shown in a structured animated fashion, like the films and animations that we have today, to replicate what happens around us in reality, and imagine if it were any different, which is what imagination is. The spindle set up the images attached to the middle of it in a rotary motion, so the events to the observer looked like they followed each other sequentially the faster the spindle was turned, even though they were independent of each other and not of one event. It shows the brain's processing that records everything it sees in the form of events, even if no linear event is there, from point A to point B. As Jacques Fresco examines, this is why we cannot reason, as we can only put together things that already exist in different ways, because of this stringently linear thinking that we have that can only say this causes this, because of that, and the result of that is this. And when I say distinguishable to the naked eye, I mean at the innate resolution we can see at because of the light we cannot perceive based off of the electromagnetic spectrum test. Therefore, it illusionistically looks like the resolution of reality, even if it isn't, because it pieces them together as so. Around 1,000 years ago in the Holy Land, small circular hovels were what were lived in by people at the time. Because of the way these hovels were shaped, with no light being able to come through, the people did not know when it was dark outside, so they cut a small hole, a window-sized shape in the top of the hovel from which to see out of. At night time, when people walked across, their shadows projected onto the wall, making it look as though they were walking upside down. In 1888, Louis Le Prince recorded the first motion picture of the 2-second Roundhay garden scene. After he mysteriously disappeared in September of 1890, supposedly by being kidnapped by Edison's goons because he invented the motion picture before him, Edison got the credit for the motion picture when he presented his kinetograph in the same year. Although people like Wordsworth's Donisthorpe came up with the idea of the camera in 1876, which he called a kinesiograph, the first to be able to produce a working camera that was able to be filmed with was by Le Prince in the year of 1888. The Lumiere brothers formed Edison's famous kinetograph invention into what it is known as today, the cinematograph, coining the term cinematography to refer to a kaleidoscope of images or images strewn together in order to produce a story out of it. In the mid-1890s, the Lumiere brothers popularized this process with their numerous experimental films centered on the actions and daily life of Victorian society. In 1886, the famed inventor Nikola Tesla was working on his Tesla coil to be able to transmit electricity wirelessly. When he patented this invention in 1888, he later set up Wardenclyffe with a Tesla tower on top of it, which he started working on in 1899, and what he called the giant magnifying transmitter inside of the building, a glorified version of a Tesla coil. This was intended to transmit electricity wirelessly to everywhere throughout the world for free, with anyone wanting to conduct it needing only to put a small thin metal rod into the ground to be able to do so. Tesla came up with the idea of the Tesla coil by wrapping around 2 spools of copper wire where the 2 electrodes pointed at each other to each end ended up wirelessly sparking the gap. Tesla said of his invention, "The intention is to send wireless power, facsimile images and radio messages everywhere throughout the world." Facsimile images. Where does that term sound familiar? That's right, it predates the conception of the GIF and the meme. He added, "When wireless is perfectly applied, the whole Earth will be converted into a huge brain," which in fact it is, all things being particles of a real rhythmic whole. Again, extraction of images from thin air is basically what the internet is today, and Tesla had this foresight when he gave the interview to the New York Times Tribunal back in 1901. Tesla thought of himself as an automaton that had no control over his own powers, just the way he reacts to the stimuli in the environment. Meaning, if he wanted to change himself, he had to change the stimuli, not the decisions that he made, as the environment made the decisions for him and he just reacted accordingly to it. We'll come more onto that later on, but it was clear that Tesla wanted transmission without the use of intervening wires. Unfortunately, the project was dismantled by 1907 and abandoned before then because Tesla ran out of funding to be able to complete his project. It was concluded that despite the ambitiousness of the project at the time, that it wouldn't have worked as it was later superseded by Maxwell's equations. You cannot just use Earth's resonant ionosphere, the outer atmosphere of the Earth just above the clouds but below the pressure of space, to be able to conduct electricity at any distance. In 2010, the wireless charging of devices that could instantly recharge any device to 100% in a matter of minutes brought back the technology that was once pioneered by Tesla, but in a practicable form. However, because there is still no way to meter and charge people for using it, it is still not instantiated for public use today. It is likely it won't be until we eventually find a way in which to move from a money-based to resource-based society. In the late 1800s, Heinrich Hertz may have discovered radio sound waves and named them Hertzian sound waves, but it was Tesla, the man nicknamed as having invented the 20th century single-handedly, who discovered how to transmit these signals in his laboratory, later having those ideas stolen by Guglielmo Marconi when he was given a tour of Tesla's laboratory in 1901. Why is this important? Well, because to transmit signals and information across thin air, you need radio waves that oscillate at a certain frequency to be able to do it. And it was these later transmission towers responsible for broadcasting of TV, radio, numerous other things, and yes, eventually the internet. When cinemas were playing one of the first films shown to a wide public audience in 1903, The Great Train Robber, you'd think that people would have thought about the sharing of people's video productions by now, and the comparison elicited by them. But this was a time when people were so fraught by technology that they fainted by being unable to understand how images on the screen were moving. And a time where people like Tesla were considered wizards beyond comprehension for being able to distribute electricity at a time when most places were still lit by candlelight. Well, most places were beginning to be lit by use of his AC induction motor, which won the War of the Currents in 1888 to light the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. But you get the point. People were generally more technophobic because they were more technologically illiterate than we are now. And just like Henry Ford monopolized the car industry in the 1920s by superseding electric cars that are now back in fashion today, with cars that were easier to mass manufacture and so cost less to the average consumer, the problem with power transmission from thin air was also that it couldn't be monetized at the time, owing to the fact of why it took so long for the internet to come into fruition. I know, arbitrarily holding back scientific progress of any kind that can benefit is the most frustrating thing to hear. It's why Tesla said, to think clearly instead of deeply, which means to arbitrarily withhold the power that you have or know that you have to change things for the better as soon as possible, which is a form of stupidity to eternally hold off the inevitable or what is preferable over the lusting after unattainable non-existent perfection. So, let's fast forward to codebreaker Alan Turing. Famous for cracking the Enigma code and for inventing print type theory at Bletchley Park, and inventing the Turing test to trick a computer into thinking it's talking to a real person, or making it indistinguishable from one, Turing's invention was instrumental in developing modern computers, and his computing technology is still the basis for how we send and receive information today. Unfortunately, he couldn't continue his work on morphogenesis, because he was found guilty by the British government and was forced to accept chemical castration for being gay, to which he committed suicide in 1954. In 1976, evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins coined the term meme, as he told of his gene-centered view of evolution in the 1976 book The Selfish Gene, which is about one's genes propagating themselves above all else for the pure reason of survival, regardless of whether they are superior or not. Dawkins defined a meme as a phenomenon that replicates itself, or is replicated by other people, which sounds like a pretty apt description of video sharing today, especially with short videos meant to just entertain and not always inform. A meme, therefore, is just simply sharing of information. It argues that we are primarily behavioural copiers, not thinkers, as this behaviour is embedded into the very way we operate and cannot be gotten rid of. We cannot simply reason out, Dawkins contends, because as primitive animals ruled by our nature, we either simply are this way or we're not. So we cannot always be blamed for our behaviour or the way that we are. Dawkins thought it was analogous to religion being spread throughout the ages because of its unshakable foundation, unable to be disseminated because of the excuse of tradition. But in truth, it's just the way we've been programmed by environment and upbringing, not as the result of ourselves. Why? Because anything that favours gene propagation through survival and reproduction is evolutionarily passed down, no matter how illogical or antithetical, which means anti-improvement, it may be to ourselves and our continued operation. As philosopher Ayn Rand says, whoever is most consistent wins, not whoever most deserves the triumph. That is the logic of nature. This is presumably what Tesla meant when alluding to that he was a victim of environment, upbringing and circumstances, not choice. Dawkins thought that mimetic inheritance had a lot to play in the staunch tradition of religion, with the familial bond of kids not usually straying away from their parents' religion and vice versa, when they are inculcated into a mode of being. Again, this is behavioural copying, because we are afraid to be our own way, and because we don't know what that actually is. In 1942, a famous instance of the meme was the message scrawled across walls, "Kilroy was here." Not too dissimilar to the caption above and below the central image with black bars on top and bottom method employed today. In 1989, the British scientist Tim Berners-Lee invented the protocol that the World Wide Web is run off, which is the HTML encoding. This is basically a hypertext links transfer, literally information being transferred from one page to the next based off of the layout, not through the text that is written on it, which meant all web pages could be infinitely linked together and gone from one site to another by the user, what is referred to as an intransient interlinking of webs. If you see the picture of what the internet looks like on Wikipedia, for instance, you'll see that it looks like a similar pattern to what the electricity of the neurons firing in the brain on a subatomic level looks like. And so it is this web of thoughts of infinite information that is metaphorically compared to being an infinite link of webs, like those cast of a spider. It is this page linking today that allows us to go from one video to another based off of the infinite interlinking of pages and addresses that continue on from one another. And finally, after all of the awful AOL dial-ups and slow page loading of the 90s, we have super fast broadband internet, wireless electricity invented in 2010 still not available for public use, 3.6 billion worldwide internet users up from the mere 89 million in the 1990s, and quantum leaps in computing technology that have still yet to happen. When we get to 2005, a team consisting of Jawed, Karim, Chad Hurley and Steve Chen came up with the idea for the video sharing website when they saw how hard it was to organise videos into one generalised place. They were looking for a video of Janet Jackson's 1995 VMA wardrobe malfunction. At the time, the site employed a rating system instead of the thumbs up or thumbs down buttons it has now, and had a much more primitive layout, with less focus on algorithms than it has now to determine user data and watch history. So the invention of YouTube, just like all other things, is not the idea of one person, but of gradual adaptation over time, just like all things that are invented, and of necessity, like practically all inventions throughout time that were discovered by experimentation and not through accidental discovery. We forget that it's not the result of ingenuity, but of experimentation and automatic induction, which is sometimes random and accidental. In other words, we didn't come to it came to us. So how did they not know of it before 2005? Well, the answer is that they did know of it, but didn't know how to apply it at the time. It's likely that anything we will ever invent in the future has also been known about before, unless accidentally discovered, but just not known how to apply it and use it for the benefit, and we will be kicking ourselves with how simple it is and for not being able to find it out sooner. But I guess we cannot be blamed for not knowing any better at the time if we are unaware that we don't know any better. The truth is that when you just put things together from what came before, and that is what all thinking consists of, we know nothing great and good. The idea for YouTube had existed all along, but at the time we didn't know how to apply it. That is the only difference, and if you have knowledge without knowing how to apply it, you cannot do anything with it. That is one of the only reasons I can think of for why it took so long for a simple site like YouTube to come about. Of course, there is more to the history of YouTube than just its invention, such as it hitting the billion user mark or being acquisitioned by Google, but for this video I'm just covering up to the invention of the site and trying to find out why it took so long for it to come about. I could have gone on much longer with this story, such as the details surrounding Alan Turing and the invention of the computer with Charles Babbage's anatomical difference engine, but for the sake of brevity I've excluded them, and they are not really that relevant to the formation of information computing and transmission. Before I end this video, I realise I haven't really answered why YouTube took so long to be created, but as with all great ideas being spontaneous flashes of inspiration, it's probably because there is no particular reason apart from the preceding history, which was typically one of technological suppression for short-term monetary gain. Just like the revolt on intellectualism with the burning of Alexandria, and Christian uprising caused 1,000 years of scientific regression in the Dark Ages, making some knowledge inaccessible that previously would have been had it been found. The technological suppression of emerging power transmission technologies had much the same effect, except the result was typically not killing those who we disagreed with, but trying to bully them into silence, as is the result with Tesla in his struggle against the elite monopolists and oligarchists of his day. An unfair power struggle that only those with the most money, and not tenacity, could have ever won. But as they say, the victors, the most consistent, even if they are not the ones to change it, are the ones who most influence society.